Heidi-ho. Hey everybody, welcome to today's session. We'll officially get started in just about 2 minutes. I like to sign on just about 2 minutes before go time, just to let everyone kind of settle in, arrive to the session so you don't feel like you're missing anything. As with all of my sessions, we always meditate whenever we come here together, and today will be no exception. So if you need a cushion close by or something to help yourself meditate when we get to that part of the workshop, maybe getting it now, getting it ready. I'm just going to kind of babble, get hydrated until we'll start on the hour, just about another 90 or so seconds. So just get yourself comfortable. Take a sip of water. Go get your water. Get it close by so you can be comfortable for our full time together. I'll just get started in just about another minute or so. I'm glad you could join me. I'm glad you could join the group. There's quite a lot of people who join for these sessions, and I'm so honored to be able to facilitate and share with you some of the best teachings that I know after teaching mindfulness for about 20 years now. So welcome into the session. I'm glad you're here. And just waiting for the countdown. So getting yourself comfortable. Maybe closing the door, letting the people know that your meditation session is starting, not to bug you for about the next hour, whatever it is. I'm just kind of waiting for the moments to count down so it can be official go time. I'm excited. I know I have a really good teaching to share with you here today. Okay, it looks like it is on the hour. Let me take a breath and just get focused. So welcome everybody, welcome to today's session. I'm Michelle Duvall, the director of the Mindful Center. Today we're going to take a look at getting ourselves off of chronic fight or flight, right? Learning how to more skillfully, more actively deactivate the stress response when it's not necessary. So really the stress response by design is created within the body to help us survive a clear and present danger, right? Usually we're supposed to only leave our stress response for about 1 to 3 minutes. That's really, when they've done research on the efficacy of full throttle stress response, it's designed to be on for about 1 to 3 minutes, and it's to help us to survive a clear and present danger, right? What we're seeing more and more of in the stress realm is that a lot of us very modern, very busy people are now starting to activate our stress response. I don't know, first thing we do when we wake up in the morning, when we think of all the things that we need to take care of, all the emails we forgot to send yesterday, or we forgot to bake the brownies for the kids' bake sale this weekend, or whatever it is. We all have so many things going on. So we wake up in the morning, we can have a tendency to activate that stress response right from the get-go. And then what we're seeing more and more of is people who keep reactivating their stress response all day long. There's no problem in the activation of the stress response. The real problem comes when we turn it on and then we either leave it on all day long or we keep reactivating that stress response. And that gives us that really big experience of being under chronic stress. How I define chronic stress is when you're feeling stress more days of the week than you're not. That could be an experience of chronic stress. So there's a couple of reasons why we do this. We're going to take a look at a really big factor in this here today. And then we're also going to take a look at how we can use a practice of mindfulness meditation to much more skillfully and effectively begin to be able to turn it off when it's no longer necessary. Sometimes it is absolutely necessary to have your stress response turned on, right? You're driving on the highway, someone cuts you off and you activate that stress response. That is a perfectly legitimate activation of the stress response. But then what happens, as I mentioned, is we tend to keep reactivating. We tell everybody how we got cut off on the highway, then we get the problematic email, and we keep on stimulating that stress response. And that can create huge problems for us, both in relation to the physiological health and well-being of our bodies, but also on the level of like heart and mind, or in our mental and emotional well-being as well. It creates a lot of problems in that realm as well. So we're going to take a look at one specific kind of mindfulness meditative practice that can help us really more skillfully deactivate the stress response, turn it off when it's not necessary to be flipped on full throttle, right? So what I decided to do for this particular workshop is I thought it would be most beneficial to keep things really, really simple. So I'm going to give one primary teaching through the lens of one primary story. This is one of the most profound stories and teachings that I know of. I've shared it many, many times throughout my 20-year career of teaching mindfulness, and I really do think that it's at the heart of why so many of us have our stress responses on and can keep them on day after day, week after week, year after year. If you've had a really problematic childhood, for example, you might be feeling like you've been, in a stressed out state since childhood. Or if you had a really toxic work environment or a relationship, it's like we turn on our stress response and then we're not always 100% sure how to turn it off. So we're going to take a look at a very simple but very profound teaching and one specific style of mindfulness meditative practice that can really help us release ourselves from this inappropriate activation of the stress response, this getting ourselves off of chronic fight or flight. So the story that I want to share with you was shared with me by a friend who is really close to me, very close in my inner circle of people. And what she shared with me was that she had an incredibly problematic childhood. She shared with me that it seemed to her like her mother never really wanted to have children in the first place. This person was a little bit older than me, and the mother was from a time where, that's what you did, especially as a female. You grew up, you got married, and you had children. But to my friend, it seemed like her mother never really wanted to have children in the first place. And to make matters a little even worse, my friend's biological father had left before she was even born, didn't even know she existed. And my friend's mother had remarried, and her new stepfather, as it turned out, was an alcoholic. And so my friend shared with me that she really grew up in a really problematic household. And how she described it, it was like she felt like she was always getting in trouble for something. She was never able to do things right or do things correctly according to her parents. If any of you have grown up in a household with an alcoholic, you can probably relate to this. The thing of it is that with alcoholics, the rules tend to change as compared to when they're sober, as compared to when they're drinking. And children really thrive in environments where there's a clear and understandable, consistent set of rules so that the child can understand, okay, when I do X, I have success, and when I engage in other behaviors, Y and Z, I get in trouble for it, and there's consequences. But if the rules are always changing, that child can never really understand how to fully experience success or how to be a good kid. And that was what my friend shared was her childhood experience. So she felt like she was always getting into trouble, always getting yelled at for something. And what she did as a way to survive this environment is she created like a voice in her head. We all have them. We all have voices in our heads. We all have a kind of narration that follows us along throughout each and every given day. in my friend's case, the voice in her head would yell at her. And why she developed this particular type of yelling at her voice was that first one of her parents would yell at her, and then they would leave, and then that voice would kick in and start yelling at her, yeah, why did you do that? That was so stupid. You're such an idiot. And what that actually helped her to do was identify with that voice of the abuser rather than identify herself as being the victim. So in essence, it gave her a little bit of power in a circumstance, in a situation within which she felt little to no power, right? So she could identify with that voice going, yeah, you are an idiot. She could at least experience some degree of control, some degree of power by identifying more with that voice that was yelling at her rather than identifying full on with the victim. And this, it turns out to be a common mechanism employed by children to get through some of these kind of more problematic and confusing types of childhoods. So the thing of it is that mental habits that we create, especially those that we create when we're really young, they don't necessarily leave us when they're no longer needed, right? So in my friend's case, she grew up, turned 18, left, went to college, started her own family. So though she didn't necessarily need that voice in her head still yelling at her to kind of help her survive her problematic childhood, the voice didn't know that. So as she left that household and went on to make her own life, that voice stayed with her. And over the years, it just kept hammering at her, yelling at her, calling her names. You know, it's that voice of that harsh inner critic that I know a lot of us can relate with. We can understand that voice that's always criticizing us, always hammering at us, always finding fault. And in my friend's case, what she shared with me was that it eventually got so bad that one evening she was setting the table for the evening meal, and she put a fork down, and that voice kicked in and said, "Why'd you put the fork there? That's a stupid place to put the fork." And my friend had this realization that, oh my gosh, I can't even put a fork down on a table without that voice yelling at me. So she started to have the realization that she probably needed a little bit of help. And what she did was she started to reach out to therapists, right? And in her case, I think this is important to even notice right here. In her case, it took her several years to really click with a therapist. And I think this is an important piece of the puzzle to kind of discuss here at the get-go. Sometimes when we talk about or we think about finding a therapist, you might make a couple phone calls. Nowadays, there's such a long wait list for so many therapists that we tend to kind of take whoever we can get or whoever's available in that moment. And a lot of times what happens is we might not click with the first or even second or even third therapist that we, get matched with. And some people, take away from that experience that therapy isn't right for them. But I think it bears acknowledging, like in my friend's case, she just kept trying to find the right one for her. And I encourage anyone who thinks they might need therapy and who haven't quite found the therapist that clicks with them, just to keep trying and to keep putting themselves out there, as did my friend. And what happened with my friend is that eventually she found a therapist that things started to really click with. And for her, this particular therapist was the first one who actually taught her how to meditate. And when he was teaching her how to meditate, he shared with her one of the most profound stories that I've ever heard. And I'd like to share it with you here today. So as this particular therapist was teaching my friend how to meditate, he shared with her the story of some Japanese soldiers. And this turns out to be a true story. So during World War II, Japan, which is, as a lot of us know, Japan is comprised of a lot of different islands. And there's even countries like the Philippines, relatively close by, that is also comprised of a lot of different islands. And what Japan did during the war was they put soldiers on a lot of these different islands all over the place. And then what actually ended up happening was that when the war was over, they weren't actually able to find all of the soldiers that had been put out on all these different islands. They weren't able to find all of these soldiers to let them know that the war was over and that they could come home. So what ended up happening is there were quite a number of soldiers that Japan just thought, oh, maybe they must have died. They even declared quite a few of them as dead. But what actually turned out to be the case is they were still out there. They were still out on these islands. A lot of them had had to retreat back into the jungles. And what some of these Japanese soldiers actually ended up doing was staying at their post for like the next 20, even 30 years after the war was over. So if you think about it, a soldier is trained to fight. A soldier is trained to man his or her post. And that was absolutely the spirit of these Japanese soldiers. They didn't know the war was over, so they were trained as soldiers. They were going to continue to fight and defend the homeland, defend their posts. And then what ended up happening, I'm thinking about one particular Japanese soldier in particular, is they found this person, this man, about 30 years after the end of the war. And they brought him home in a very specific way. And this is a very important piece of the puzzle. They brought this particular soldier home to a hero's welcome. It would have been so easy to criticize this soldier, be like, what were 30 years you stayed out there? Like, why didn't you swim in? Why didn't you try to find some contact with somebody? Why did you stay out there so long? And I'm sure he did get a lot of criticism. It's like you can't do anything out in the world without somebody criticizing you for it, right? But what Japan did as a whole is they brought these soldiers back home and gave them a hero's welcome. Because if you think about it, these soldiers had done what they were trained to do. They had defended the homeland. Even when year after year went by, no word, they stayed manning their posts. So the reason that this therapist shared this story with my friend when he was teaching her how to meditate is that, as it turns out, this is actually a really good metaphor for the mind. So in the mind, we all have a lot of different islands up there in the mind. It's much more conventional to talk about it as terms of like compartments, right? So we compartmentalize a lot of things that happen to us that we don't know how to process. We don't have the time to process. Let's say you go to work one day and a coworker acts really inappropriately around you. Let's say you're 21, you don't know how to process that experience. And then the next day comes and you just have to go right back to work again. And so we can compartmentalize that experience, kind of push it off, put it in a box, lock it up, and so that we can keep going on about our business as best we can. Another way to understand this phenomenon on the level of mind is to use this metaphor of islands. We have all these different islands that comprise the mind. And for so many of us, if not all of us, at some point or other in our lives, we've had to soldier up, right? We've had to put soldiers on some, if not all, of our little islands in the mind so as to help us to survive a really problematic or really challenging or really traumatic experience or situation. So for some of us, it happened in childhood, right? You had a really problematic household experience. And in order for you to survive that experience, you had to soldier up. You had to fight your way through that experience. And so unbeknownst to you, as a methodology of survival, you put soldiers out on all these little islands to help you to fight and to help you to survive. This can also happen, like, for example, if you've ever had a job, and I know a lot of us have, where you've worked in a really toxic environment. Bad people doing bad things each and every day to each other. And to be able to still receive that much needed paycheck, maybe you too had to kind of soldier up, put your battle face on, your war paint on, to go to work every day, to just get yourself through the day so you could collect the paycheck to feed the family, to pay the mortgage, whatever it is. Or a relationship that you might have been in that proved to be toxic. I know that I've been in some toxic relationships in my past throughout my life. And it's confusing at first because a lot of times, the love thing and the control thing, it gets all wound up together. And looking back, we realize we should have left the relationship early on. But while we were in it, we didn't necessarily have the skill to be able to know how to, work through that, move through that, get ourselves out of that experience. So we stayed. And as a way of surviving that relationship, we might have had to soldier up, right? So to put our defenses on all the little islands in the mind. Or if you've ever had like a diagnosis, I know a lot of you know I had cancer, and how I had to be during that time of diagnosis through treatment. I had to be very different in my mind than I'm able to be now that I've been cleared of cancer. I've been able to move through that experience with disease. And I know a lot of you can relate to that. How you had to be during that time was like you had to go to battle. You had to fight for your survival. You had to soldier up on the level of mind. And some of you might even still be in the battle, right? Maybe you're still in a serious diagnosis, or maybe you've got someone in your family, a child or a loved one, that is fighting a disease or an illness or whatever it is, and you kind of have to be a certain way in the mind to help both yourself and your loved one be able to survive. So this soldiering up, this putting different soldiers in all the various islands of the mind, turns out to be a very common mechanism that we humans employ to help us survive very confusing, very difficult, very problematic experiences. And then what happens a lot of times is when we get out of those circumstances, like in the case of my friend, when she moved out of that problematic household, all of her soldiers on all her different islands in the mind didn't necessarily receive the message that the war is now over. They didn't get the message. So they stay fighting. They stay defending their island, defending the homeland, fighting every day still for our survival. Or maybe you got yourself out of that toxic relationship, but you find yourself still with all of your defenses up, even though you've met a nice person, you know this is a nice person, but you still have this need to defend. Perhaps you're still in that scenario as well, where all of your soldiers that help you to survive that relationship didn't receive the message that the war is over. It's okay to set down your arms. It's okay to come back home. And so turns out to be a huge piece of the puzzle of why so many of us have such strong tendencies to not only consistently and chronically activate our stress response, but it's also a huge piece of the puzzle of why we not only activate them, but then why we keep activating them all day long, all week long, week after week, month after month, year after year sometimes. Because those soldiers that helped us to survive at some point or another in our life didn't necessarily get the transmission, didn't get the message that the war is now over. So that's the first piece of the puzzle that's incredibly important, in my view, to recognize why it can be so hard to live a life of peace and ease, even though your external conditions might be very peaceful and easy, because we haven't skillfully been able to reach all the soldiers that we've put up for defenses on the level of mind. So that's the first piece of the puzzle. The second piece, which I think is equally important, if not sometimes even more important than this recognition that we might still be all soldiered up to fight that war because we haven't let everyone know that it's over. The second piece of the puzzle to understand, if we go back to that story that the therapist told my friend about the Japanese soldiers, what did Japan do when they found them? How did they bring them home? How did they relieve them of their duties? With a hero's welcome. They honored these soldiers for what in Japan is known as the samurai spirit. Right? The samurai spirit is that of the warrior. Never give up, never surrender, man your post at all costs. So when these soldiers were brought back, they were honored, respected, lauded, celebrated, because they had fulfilled their duty to their country. What many of us do in relation to these voices in the head, right? And the easiest way to kind of understand these voices or these soldiers is to understand it as the inner critic, right? So the inner critic is a soldier that you developed at some point or other in your life to help you to survive a problematic or a confusing, challenging, traumatic experience. You should know this about your own mind, and that is that your mind is always trying to help you. I'm going to say that again because it's so important. Your mind is always trying to help you. It might not feel that way anymore, because if you still have all these soldiers in activation mode and you're not still at war, it can feel like your mind is constantly fighting against you. Like in the case of my friend putting that fork down on the dinner table. That experience probably really felt like to her that her mind was fighting against her own self, right? That her mind was not trying to work in her greatest benefit. But the truth of it is that the mind is always trying to work for your benefit, always trying to be of help. But the problem comes is that many of its methodologies or many of its habits that it developed in order to help you were either created when we were like 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. We were really young. And so we didn't know how to most skillfully use our own mind to really help us. Or a lot of times these methodologies of mind or these habits of mind that we develop and create in the moment to help us to survive are actually developed within the realm of really stressful experiences. So typically when we're under high levels of stress, we might not be at our best and brightest. We might not be able to choose and select the most skillful, methodologies or habits of mind that's really going to help us move through problematic and challenging scenarios. So a lot of these habits of mind were developed when either we were really young or we were just scared for our basic survival. And now we've kept them unintentionally. How I like to put it is they just haven't gotten the memo that the war is over and they can stand down. And now what we're doing is, instead of honoring these habits of mind, we tend to continue to fight against them. So if you think about, like, say, your inner critic, that voice that's always criticizing everything you wear, how you look, what you say, how you said it, whatever, it's always picking, fault finding, narrating your life through the lens of everything you did wrong and bad and stupid. How many of you have actually taken the time to really honor that inner critic? Probably not a one of us. But if you first recognize, or at least open the door, that your mind is always trying to help you, and that somewhere along the line you develop that voice of the inner critic to help you, and maybe it was the same as with my friend, so that you could identify with the strength of the criticizer rather than being the victim of the criticism, right? That's so common, so prevalent in how we can manage stress, especially when we're young. So instead of honoring this soldier of the inner critic, what do? We tend to hate it. We tend to fight against it. We tend to just keep wanting it to be gone. Just leave me alone. Just stop. And so we're fighting, in essence, one of our own soldiers. But you got to remember, what is the soldier trained to do? It's trained to fight and defend. So the more you fight, for example, your inner critic, the more it fights back. And then we get locked in this like eternal, perpetual kind of power struggle within our own minds, where the inner critic is criticizing, we want it gone, we're fighting against, so it fights harder, and we get stuck there. I believe that one of the most helpful pieces of mindfulness meditation is found within this ability to actually honor what is. Honor and bring some respect to and for what is arising for us on the level of mind. And to begin to recognize that these voices in our heads that's criticizing, picking, keep activating our chronic stress response through fear and doubt and criticism and all of that gnarly stuff that's so commonly associated with that inner critic. We tend to keep fighting against it, which keeps it fighting against us, instead of doing what we really need to do, which is to first let those soldiers in the mind, of the mind, know that the war is over. In this moment, the war is over. And then to secondly, begin to honor those voices, honor the inner critic, honor our kind of inner soldiers for the very fact that they helped us to survive. If you are here watching this workshop now, you survived. You made it through. Whatever it was, the toxic relationship or the diagnosis or the childhood or the relationship or the job, whatever it is, your mind helped you to survive it. And now we need to let it know, these soldiers in the mind, that the war is over. And we need to begin to honor them for their service to us. They fulfilled their duty. They helped us with their ultimate duty, which was to help us to survive. Before we move into a meditation that is designed to help us do exactly this, I want to first note and acknowledge the fact that some of you who might be watching this workshop now might still be in the war. I know that some of you might still be going through an active diagnosis. You still might be going through treatment for cancer or some other illness. Or you might have a child or a loved one who is still fighting for their lives. So you might still be in the war. Or you might still be at the job, or you might still be in that toxic relationship, which of course we would say, get out, get help as soon as you possibly can. But to acknowledge that for some of us, the war is indeed over. And for some of us, we might still be in the war, in the fight. And so in those cases, what we can do is we can find moments of the day or night within which we're not actively at war. So if we again go back to our Japanese soldier story and metaphor, even those amazing soldiers who manned their posts for 30 years, even they had to rest and recover and sleep. Even they had times and experience of downtime. Maybe they couldn't fully drop their guard all day long. But the point of it is that for sustainability, to be able to still live, you have to be able to at least find moments of the day. So say you have a problematic home life, and then you go to work and there are moments of the day where you're actually safe, where you're not at war in the moment. You're around safe coworkers. There's a ceasefire for the moment. Then we can move into that space of letting our physiology and our mind, our hearts, our emotions know that in this moment, the war is not active. There is a ceasefire in this moment. Right? So finding little snippets and moments of time when we can actually feel safe so that we can let down our guards, soften, turn off our stress response, even when you're still maybe in the war itself. So there's something called allostatic load. Allostatic load. And it's something that happens in the body when we trigger and then leave on our fight or flight response. We leave it on chronically. So allostatic load refers to the cumulative physiological burden of stress. So when environmental challenges, what's happening in our life, exceed our individual ability to skillfully cope with them, then allostatic load and even overload can happen. Or said in more lay terms, allostatic load is the wear and tear on the body, which accumulates over time as an individual is exposed to repeated or chronic stress. So allostatic load can turn into heart problems, heart disease. It can turn into high blood pressure, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, even insomnia. Allostatic load can absolutely increase inflammation in the body, which is the precursor to so many different kinds of illnesses and diseases, cancer being one of them. So allostatic load, that chronic burden of stress, of chronic stress, wears out your body eventually and makes it more susceptible to issues and diseases. Allostatic load is just like it's a burden that's too heavy for your physiological systems to support and to sustain. It's unsustainable. And it's not only happening on our physiological levels as well, but also on our mental and emotional levels as well. Carrying around this burden of just chronic, ongoing, lasting stress creates mental and emotional issues as well, not just issues of the body. So whether your war is over, but your mental soldiers just haven't gotten the word of it yet, or if you're still in the war, but maybe you can find pieces and moments and a couple of breaths here and there throughout the day or the night where you can actively and intentionally tell your soldiers it's okay to stand down in this moment. It's okay to deactivate fight or flight, to turn off the stress response. And then we can all kind of move in together into this sense of honoring this fight, this battle that we've been through, that I believe each and every human being on a long enough timeline at some point will have to engage in, will have to experience a fight for our life, for our survival, be it physical, emotional, spiritual, whatever it is. So I'm going to teach you how to do this, these two aspects of practice now in a meditation. I'm going to guide you through it. So let's get ready to meditate. So I always, when I start a meditation, I always lift my arms up overhead as a way to kind of stretch out my shoulders, stretch out my back. So that's how we're going to begin this meditation. You've been sitting for a while. You can stand up, you can stretch, you can move your body a little bit, relieving any tension, any stiffness with a little bit of movement and stretch. So just really attending to the needs of the body right now. So maybe getting a drink of water or just kind of stretching out your legs, rolling your shoulders or ankles. Maybe rubbing out any tension in your brow or temples or jaw. And then just whenever you feel like you're ready to start to settle, just kind of figure out, explore how you wish to sit and hold the body for this particular practice. I believe this to be one of the most important practices in meditation. So I usually encourage people for this particular practice to do it sitting upright if you can. Finding a way of sitting right now in your body that you can feel comfortable and relaxed as best you can. While still having some degree of poise or uprightedness sustained in the body. kind of found and established your posture, maybe taking a couple of deeper breaths. Deeper breathing can be a really effective way of turning off our stress response in the short term. So just taking some deeper breaths as a way to communicate to the body that in this moment it's okay to begin to let our guards down. And then let's just let the breath alone, right? Leave the breath to do its thing, no longer controlling the breath. And I just want you to begin to notice, how do you feel in this moment? Do you feel completely at ease? Or do you notice that you do have a little bit of stress, or maybe a lot of stress in the body? And so here's really this first piece of the puzzle is when we enter into meditation, mindfulness practice, we first have to just kind of accept and acknowledge what's already here. And if you do notice that you have some stress response on, like your body feels activated, feels a little stressed, we're not going to fight against it. We're not going to try to make it go away. Instead, what I first want you to do is just kind of notice how you're feeling, feel how you're feeling. And then just however you're feeling, we're just gonna kind of sit with it. Breathe with it. So just seeing if you can breathe with however you're feeling in this moment. Feeling the breath rising and falling. And just kind of more or less accepting that this is how you feel in this moment. And it's okay to be feeling exactly how you're feeling. want you to try to do is I want you to just hold this phrase in your mind and just kind of see what happens. And the phrase is, the war is over. The war is over. And I just want you to kind of observe what your mind and body does with that phrase, with that concept. How does your mind and body react when you think the phrase, the war is over? So for some of us, when we do this, the mind will start to fight this concept, this notion. No, it isn't. What are you talking about? It's never going to be over. That's a soldier, right? Trained to fight. So that's its go-to, its knee-jerk response, to fight against anything and everything. So what do you do with that? You simply notice and observe. And maybe even recognize, oh, that's a soldier. For others of you, you'll hold that phrase, the war is over, and a big part of you will agree. And there might also be a newfound acknowledgement that you have at times in your life been through war, had to fight to survive. And maybe this is the first time you've actually ever actively and intentionally acknowledged that you have been at war before in your life. And that now it's over. So our only practice here right now is simply to hold this phrase in the mind. The war is over. And then to simply observe your response, your reaction. on the level of mind and body. And now what I want you to do is I want you to see if you can notice any aspect of your present moment experience that makes you feel safe. Can you notice any aspect of your present moment experience? Maybe it's the feeling of the sturdiness of the chair beneath you, or the sound of silence in the house, which means nobody's arguing in the moment. Or just whatever it is, can you notice any aspect of your present moment experience that makes you feel safe? Sometimes I'll simply use the feeling of gravity, right, holding me down, keeping me safe from spinning off the side of the earth. So just whatever it is, really finding and being present for any aspects of your experience right now that is a sign of safety. This is another way that we have of telling our mind and body that in this moment there is a ceasefire. Just in this moment, I am not at war. Let yourself really feel this if you can. And then finally, we can honor the soldiers, the fight that allowed us to survive whatever it is we've been through or are going through. I want you to find a way that makes sense to you now to honor your soldiers. Honoring the fight of your soldiers that allowed you to make it here to this day, to this breath, to this moment. You made it here. We don't know what the future holds, but we can honor the past fight, the soldiers that kept us safe and strong and alive. The voices and inner critics in our head that seem so wrong now, but that helped us at some point in our lives. It helped us. We honor you now. We honor you now. And then the final piece of this meditation is an acknowledgement that we all have a sense of peace somewhere inside of us. This is why each and every one of us yearns for peace. It's our true nature. So for this final piece of this practice, see if you can feel it somewhere in your body, somewhere in your mind. This space of peace. Even if anxiety and tension is present, can you notice how your heart longs for peace? Can still know what it is, can still feel it, even if it's just for a moment. in this moment, just in this moment, the war is over. As we come to the close of the meditation, we can again begin to move and stretch. Again, waking up the body, caring for the body through movement and stretch. And then just opening your eyes when you're ready. Final note before I leave you. This is not a practice that is one and done, like you do it once and you're done. This is a practice that warrants repeating, maybe daily for some time, especially if you've been living in chronic fight or flight. Maybe finding scattered moments throughout the day when you can feel into what's safe in your present moment experience. Maybe taking a moment to hold in the mind, there is a ceasefire in this moment, or the war is over, noticing how we react and we respond to that. Recognizing that if we fight that concept, no, we're still at war, there is no ceasefire, that voice, that narration, that reaction is a soldier. And so we can honor that reaction, that response, that soldier. We can thank it. Everyone's going to have different ways of honoring or showing gratitude or thanks. Explore and find what makes most sense to you. How do you honor your fight? How do you honor your soldiers? How do you honor the fact that you survived to breathe another breath, live another moment? Okay. Thank you so much for being here with me today, being here with everybody. Can't see you, but I sure can feel you. I hope it brings you benefit, and keep on trucking, buddy. Get help if you need it. Keep on trucking. You got this. Love to everybody. I'll see you next time.